Excited to give an update on our revised farm-to-school grants, which put farmers first and promote healthy choices, healthy families, and healthy outcomes. This year's opportunity streamlined the application process, removed woke DEI requirements, and supports expanding access for small family farms to markets and infrastructure by facilitating connections to the child nutrition marketplace. The farm to school application period just closed, and I'm so excited to note that USDA received a record-breaking 645 applications. The record high in the past was 386, so we nearly doubled that. The awards will be announced early in the spring. We continue to actively work with Secretary Kennedy in crafting sensical dietary guidelines for Americans, which are set to be released early next year, so in a couple of weeks. Federal nutrition advice must be sound, simple, and clear.
Let me watch this clip and immediately feel what you feel, because this is not some abstract policy debate divorced from material consequences. This is a real person standing at a lectern bragging about eliminating equity protections from programs designed to feed children, and the sheer audacity of it should make your blood pressure spike, because in alignment with President Trump's executive order entitled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preference, USDA is pausing the grant program. And listen to those words, truly listen, because they've taken the entire architecture of justice, the scaffolding that holds up any possibility of equitable access to resources in a society still drowning in the legacies of systemic racism and redlining and food apartheid, and they've rebranded it as radical and wasteful, transforming civil rights protections into ideological excess in a rhetorical move so breathtakingly cynical it demands we stop and recognize the authoritarian playbook at work here. You heard her actually celebrate with barely concealed triumph, that they received a record-breaking 645 applications after stripping away what she dismissively calls woke DEI requirements, as though diversity, equity, and inclusion were linguistic contaminants rather than the bare minimum acknowledgement that this country has spent centuries constructing barriers to opportunity for Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color, and that dismantling those barriers requires intentional structural intervention, not colorblind mythology dressed up as meritocracy. The framing device she deploys is insidious in its simplicity, and this is where we need to dissect the propaganda with surgical precision, because she positions farmers against equity, as though supporting small family farms and promoting healthy outcomes somehow exists in tension with ensuring that grants reach communities systematically excluded from agricultural infrastructure, and this is the fundamental lie at the heart of conservative discourse around DEI, the construction of a false binary, where justice for marginalized communities is framed as discrimination against white people, or in this case white farmers, when the Trump administration has used it as a blanket term for funding that benefits minority, even though the actual legislative mandate behind these programs mandated that the agency prioritize geographic diversity and equitable distribution among tribal, rural, and urban communities, because Congress understood that left to their own devices, grant systems replicate existing power structures, and existing power structures in American agriculture are soaked in the blood and soil of dispossession. But here's the bombshell that should radicalize anyone still clinging to the fantasy that this administration operates in good faith. When they talk about Make America Healthy Again, they don't mean everybody, because if they're saying that they're canceling this program because it's radical and wasteful and DEI, then that means that they don't want non-white kids having access to fruits and vegetables, and that quote should be seared into the national consciousness, because it exposes the material reality underneath all the culture war rhetoric about wokeness. This is about denying resources to children of color in communities already devastated by food deserts and intergenerational poverty, communities where the south end of town near the municipal airport has no grocery stores, no food pantries, mired in a federally recognized food deserts, and those communities were finally starting to see programs that connected local farmers to school cafeterias, that built gardens where children could pick blueberries and peas and learn about agriculture. And now 5 USDA programs have had their funding pulled since President Trump's inauguration, while at least 21 others remain frozen. And last month the agency terminated some $1.113 billion slated to be distributed through the local food purchase assistance programs, and we're talking about over $1 billion vanishing from programs designed to feed children and support local farmers simultaneously. The numerical sleight of hand she performs deserves particular scrutiny, because she wants you to be dazzled by the increase in applications, wants you to conclude that removing equity requirements liberated farmers from bureaucratic tyranny, but this correlation is not causation, and the deeper analysis reveals something far more troubling, because what they've actually done is make it easier for those who already have institutional access, who already speak the language of grant applications, who already have the infrastructure and social capital to navigate federal systems, to capture even more resources while applicants to the Patrick Leahy Farm to School Grant Program received an email from the U.S. Department of Agriculture informing them no applications would be reviewed for the 2025 fiscal year, which means they literally canceled the previous competition that had equity protections and relaunched it without them, creating a manufactured comparison designed to justify their ideological purge. And here's what makes this especially perverse from a policy standpoint. The Farm to School program is mandated by Congress, and it's supposed to have at least $5 million in dedicated funds each year. So they're not just rolling back Obama-era initiatives or Biden-era initiatives, they're actively refusing to implement programs that Congress specifically authorized and funded, which raises profound questions about executive overreach and the separation of powers that should alarm anyone, regardless of ideological orientation. Let me take you deeper into the material consequences, because this isn't happening in a vacuum, and the communities being devastated by these cuts are the same communities that have been fighting for scraps for generations. Farmers had a $45,000 climate resiliency grant canceled. The Biden administration created a program to reward climate-smart practices on mostly small farms, the kind that queer farmers and farmers of color typically operate. But the Trump administration ended the program, and the defunding has set their farm back years. And when you strip away the bureaucratic language, what you're left with is a farmer who can't afford new glasses or new tires for their pickup truck, someone avoiding healthcare costs, because the federal government decided that supporting marginalized farmers was too woke for the new American order. The cruelty is the point, as the saying goes. But it's more than cruelty. It's a systematic dismantling of every institutional mechanism that might redistribute resources toward those historically excluded from them, and targeting DEI is a red herring. It speaks volumes that you intend to continue to discriminate against black farmers. And that assessment from the president of the Black Farmers and Agriculturalists Association cuts through all the rhetorical fog because they understand what's happening here. They've lived through the USDA's horrific history of discrimination that led to the Pigford settlements, and they're watching the same patterns reassert themselves under the guise of colorblind neutrality. The invocation of Secretary Kennedy in the clip adds another layer of absurdity to this nightmare, because we're supposed to believe that the brainworm conspiracy theorist who wants to ban seed oils and promote raw milk is going to craft sensible dietary guidelines in collaboration with an administration that just stripped equity protections from school food programs. As Secretaries Brooke Rollins and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. claim they want to make Americans healthy again, yet instead of leveraging one of the strongest tools available to improve public health, the dietary guidelines for Americans, they're undermining it with misinformations because the actual science-based recommendations that would improve public health, things like increasing access to fresh fruits and vegetables, especially in underserved communities, get sacrificed at the altar of culture war posturing. As serious as the chronic disease epidemic is, the DGA cannot be the cause of this crisis when most Americans don't follow the guidelines, and a 2024 systematic review found that greater adherence to the DGA is linked to lower mortality risk, yet the average HEI score for Americans is only 58 out of 100, which means the problem isn't that the guidelines are too woke or too complicated. The problem is that people can't afford to follow them, and this administration's response is to cut the very programs that make healthy food accessible, while promising to simplify the guidelines down to 4 pages, as though the complexity of nutrition science can be reduced to fortune cookie wisdom. The broader context of the DEI purge should terrify anyone who believes in democratic governance, because the Office of Personnel Management directed the heads of all federal agencies to close any federal agency DEI offices, place the employees of those agencies on paid leave, take down any outward-facing media of any such DEI offices, and terminate any DEI-related contractors by January 20, and federal agencies are directed to submit written plans for executing a reduction in force action regarding the employees who work in a DEI office by January 31, 2025, and the speed and comprehensiveness of this purge is unprecedented. This is shock doctrine applied to civil rights infrastructure, a deliberate attempt to dismantle within days what took decades to build, and the message is unmistakable, that any institutional acknowledgement of historical and ongoing discrimination will be treated as ideological contraband subject to immediate elimination. They're not just ending programs, the executive orders direct the Attorney General to identify private sector companies with egregious and discriminatory DEI programs, signaling potential investigations of publicly traded corporations and large nonprofits, as well as litigation, and they establish a federal policy of recognizing 2 genders only, cease virtually all DEI-related activities in the federal workforce, and rescind Executive Order 1146, which requires federal contractors to implement affirmative action programs, which means they're weaponizing the Justice Department to intimidate the private sector into abandoning diversity initiatives under threat of federal investigation, transforming the government into an enforcer of white supremacist ideology, masquerading as colorblind equality. And here's where the farm-to-school grants story intersects with the larger architecture of oppression, because just over 14.3 million children received a school lunch on an average day during the 2022 to 2023 school year, a decrease of 1.2 million children in breakfast and 1.8 million children in lunch, and school breakfast decreased by 1.2 million children, and school lunch decreased by 1.8 million children, with the end of the pandemic-era waivers that allowed schools to offer meals to all students at no charge, which means millions of children lost access to free meals when universal free lunch ended, and instead of responding to this crisis by expanding access, instead of recognizing that receiving free or reduced-price school lunches reduces food insecurity by at least 3.8%, and economists estimate that the receipt of a free or reduced-price school lunch reduces obesity rates by at least 17%. This administration is actively making it harder for schools to access the grants that would connect them with local food systems and fresh produce. The farm-to-school grants that they're celebrating gutting were specifically designed to address the intersection of agricultural policy and child nutrition, to create markets for small farmers while simultaneously improving the quality of food that children eat at school, and by stripping the equity requirements they're ensuring that schools in wealthy, predominantly white districts will capture the grants while schools in poor districts with higher percentages of students of color will fall further behind, replicating and intensifying the very disparities that DEI frameworks were designed to address. Let me be absolutely clear about what's at stake, because this extends far beyond school lunch and touches the existential question of what kind of society we're building. The executive orders challenge the programs of publicly traded corporations, large nonprofits, philanthropic foundations, professional associations, and institutions of higher education that are designed to advance equity, including by threatening legal action, with the obvious goal of chilling their programs, which means we're watching the construction of a comprehensive apparatus of intimidation, designed to make any institution too afraid to pursue racial justice, to acknowledge historical discrimination, to implement policies that might redistribute power and resources. This is authoritarianism not in the sense of jackbooted thugs kicking down doors, though we're seeing plenty of that at the border, but in the sense of the total mobilization of state power to enforce ideological conformity, to make diversity, equity, and inclusion literally unspeakable in institutional contexts, to transform civil rights into thought crime. The education implications alone should spark mass resistance, because the U.S. Department of Education announced in March it's investigating 52 universities in 41 states, alleging that programs like the PhD Project, which supports Black, Latino, and Native American doctoral students in business, violate the Civil Rights Act by using racial criteria in admissions and student support, which inverts the entire purpose of civil rights law, using Title VII and the Civil Rights Act, not to combat discrimination, but to prevent institutions from actively working to remedy the effects of past and present discrimination. And this is the same strategy deployed in the Students for Fair Admissions case that gutted affirmative action in college admissions, the weaponization of colorblind ideology, to preserve white advantage while claiming to protect Asian American students who themselves face discrimination but get instrumentalized in service of white supremacist ends. And when you connect this to the farm-to-school grants, you see the totalizing logic at work. Every institution that touches the lives of children, whether it's universities or K-12 schools, or agricultural programs, or nutrition assistance, is being systematically purged of any framework that might acknowledge or address racial inequality. The connection to RFK Jr. and the dietary guidelines adds a particularly grotesque dimension, because Kennedy has made no secret of his affinity for meat and the saturated fat that comes along with it, describing his own eating habits as a carnivore diet. And alongside his embrace of meat, Kennedy has also championed full-fat dairy products, saying he plans to end the attack on whole milk cheese and yogurt in the new guidelines, which means the dietary guidelines that shape federal nutrition programs serving tens of millions of children are being written by someone whose personal dietary preferences run contrary to decades of nutritional science. With no sign of the updated dietary guidelines, Kennedy said, "We're probably going to get them out at the end of October." And Christopher Gardner, a member of the advisory committee, told Sentient he and his team were completely ghosted by the HHS after handing over their report. "No one will tell us the name of a person who's working on it. which reveals the utter contempt for scientific process and expertise that characterizes this administration. They convened an expert committee that spent years reviewing evidence, and then they simply ignored the committee's recommendations because those recommendations didn't align with their ideological priors and Kennedy's weird carnivore obsessions. But underneath all the pseudo-scientific nonsense about seed oils and raw milk is a far more sinister agenda, because this administration has ended farm-to-school programs that help low-income Americans access the local whole healthy foods. And when you say you want to make America healthy again, while simultaneously cutting over $1 billion from programs that feed children fresh local food, while stripping equity protections that ensure those programs reach the children who need them most, while attacking the scientific dietary guidelines that actually do reduce mortality and improve health outcomes, what you're really saying is that you want to make wealthy white America healthy again, and everyone else can go hungry. The Make America Healthy Again slogan is Make America Great Again, with a wellness influencer aesthetic, the same nostalgic longing for a mythical past when men were men, and women knew their place and everyone else knew to stay invisible, now repackaged as concern for chronic disease, while the actual policies exacerbate every social determinant of health. The farm's first framing in the clip deserves particular attention, because it's a textbook example of how conservative rhetoric weaponizes legitimate concerns to advance an illegitimate agenda. And yes, we should absolutely support small family farms. Yes, we should want to expand their access to markets and infrastructure. Yes, we should facilitate connections to the child nutrition marketplace, but the implication that equity requirements somehow prevented this, that DEI was an obstacle to helping farmers, rather than a framework for ensuring that farmers from marginalized communities could access these programs, reveals the bad faith at the core of this entire enterprise. As part of the USDA's DEI initiatives, the representative worked to establish cooperative agreements. For instance, the USDA might partner with a historically black college to increase land access that brought more black farmers into the fold. There's a big language barrier between black folks and these agencies. I'm going to say this respectfully. I think folks in office know there's a barrier, and sometimes do not go outside themselves, which is why we have these DEI initiatives. And that testimony from someone who actually worked in these programs exposes the reality that DEI isn't bureaucratic bloat or ideological indoctrination. It's the recognition that federal agencies have historically been structured in ways that exclude people who don't have institutional connections or cultural capital, and unless you actively work to break down those barriers, you perpetuate discrimination through neglect. The record-breaking applications number that she brandishes like a trophy is particularly galling, because they want credit for streamlining the application process as though that's the innovation, as though removing equity protections and simplifying paperwork are equivalent achievements. But the official notice from the USDA's Food and Nutrition Service stated that the agency will not review applications, nor will it award grants this year, and the agency did, however, note that it was making plans for an improved competition funding opportunity, and in an email, a USDA spokesperson said in alignment with Trump's executive order, the agency had paused this year's Patrick Leahy Farm-to-School program competition and is now revising the application for the next fiscal year, which means they literally canceled grants that were already in process, left applicants in limbo without explanation, and then relaunched the program stripped of equity protections as though this constitutes improvement. The improved competition is improved only in the sense that it's more efficient at excluding the communities that Congress specifically wanted these grants to reach. And we cannot discuss this without addressing the profound intersection with food justice and environmental justice, because the communities being cut off from farm-to-school grants are the same communities disproportionately affected by climate change, by industrial agriculture, by food deserts created through decades of racist redlining and discriminatory lending, and the Biden administration created a program to reward climate-smart practices on mostly small farms, the kind that queer farmers and farmers of color typically operate. But the Trump administration ended the program, and the defunding has set their farm back years, which connects the DEI purge directly to the administration's broader climate denialism, because sustainable agriculture and equity are intertwined. The farmers most likely to use climate-smart practices are often those from marginalized communities who have been excluded from the extractive industrial model, and supporting those farmers advances both environmental and social justice simultaneously, which is precisely why this administration is targeting these programs. They understand that the alternative food systems emerging from black farmers, indigenous farmers, queer farmers, immigrant farmers represent not just economic competition, but ideological challenge to the logic of racial capitalism that has structured American agriculture since slavery and the genocide of indigenous peoples. The broader assault on nutrition assistance needs to be understood as part of this same project, because it's not coincidental that they're attacking farm-to-school grants, while the latest Household Food Security Report reveals that 47.4 million people lived in households experiencing food insecurity last year, an increase of 3.2 million compared to 2022 and 13.5 million compared to 2021, which means food insecurity is getting worse, not better. And the rational policy response would be expanding access to nutrition programs, not decimating them, but rationality presumes that the goal is actually to feed hungry people rather than to dismantle every vestige of the social safety net, while scapegoating marginalized communities. When all children, regardless of household income, have access to healthy school meals at no charge, stigma decreases and participation increases, and according to research conducted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, schools experience a 12.1% increase in school breakfast and a 6.8% increase in school lunch upon implementing CEP, and increasing participation allows more children to experience the educational and health benefits of school meals. And we have the evidence, we know what works. Universal free school meals reduce hunger and improve health and educational outcomes. And yet this administration is moving in the opposite direction, because the cruelty is indeed the point, because hungry children are easier to control, because families struggling to feed their kids don't have time or energy to organize resistance, because maintaining hierarchies of who deserves to eat and who doesn't is essential to maintaining all the other hierarchies of racial capitalism. The historical context is crucial, because the USDA has one of the most documented histories of racial discrimination of any federal agency. Targeting DEI is a red herring. It speaks volumes that you intend to continue to discriminate against black farmers, and this isn't hyperbole or speculation. There were literally federal lawsuits, the Pigford cases, that revealed systematic discrimination against black farmers in loan programs and disaster assistance and conservation programs, decades of deliberate exclusion that accelerated the loss of black-owned farmland from 14% of all farms in 1910 to less than 2% today, one of the largest wealth transfers in American history achieved through bureaucratic violence, through loan denials and delayed payments and foreclosures and intimidation, and the DEI frameworks being dismantled were inadequate responses to this history, baby steps toward acknowledging and remedying centuries of theft, and now even those baby steps are being characterized as radical and wasteful, as though the radical thing is trying to achieve equity rather than the centuries of state-sanctioned dispossession that created the inequality in the first place. Every element of this story reveals the authoritarian logic at work, because they're not just implementing different policies, they're attempting to make certain questions unaskable, certain frameworks unthinkable, and the speed and comprehensiveness of the DEI purge, combined with the threats against private sector organizations, and the weaponization of the Justice Department, and the systematic defunding of programs serving marginalized communities, adds up to something far more totalizing than normal political disagreement. This is an attempt to transform the entire institutional landscape of American society, to make racial justice as a concept illegitimate, to ensure that no institution, public or private, can implement policies that acknowledge structural racism or work to remedy its effects, and they're doing it while wrapping themselves in the language of colorblindness and meritocracy, and protecting taxpayers and making America healthy, deploying every euphemism and dog whistle available to disguise what is fundamentally a white nationalist project. And we need to talk about the farmers themselves, because the narrative being sold is that removing DEI requirements helps small family farms access grants and markets, but the reality is more complex because these cuts show the administration's priority, which is definitely not local food systems, and more importantly than that, it's not people, and that assessment cuts to the bone because local food systems are inherently more equitable than industrial agriculture. They create shorter supply chains and community wealth and ecological sustainability, and the farmers who gravitate toward these systems often do so precisely because they're seeking alternatives to exploitive industrial models, which means the farmers being hurt by these cuts include many of the small family farmers that the administration claims to champion. The beneficiaries aren't small farmers, they're the large agricultural interests that have always dominated USDA programs, the industrial operations that produce commodity crops through extractive methods and rely on exploited labor and receive the vast majority of federal subsidies, and by gutting programs that prioritize small farms and local markets and equity in distribution, this administration is reinforcing the power of industrial agriculture while pretending to do the opposite. The connection to the broader Project 2025 agenda is unmistakable, even though they try to disavow that connection, because this is the playbook, the systematic capture and transformation of federal agencies to advance a Christian nationalist white supremacist agenda, The immediate purging of anyone associated with diversity or equity or climate science or any other framework that might challenge their worldview, the installation of ideologues and sycophants in positions of power, the weaponization of government authority to punish enemies and reward loyalists, and all of it happening so fast and across so many fronts simultaneously that resistance becomes difficult to coordinate because by the time you mobilize around one atrocity, 3 more have been committed. This is authoritarian governance 101. Overwhelm the opposition with constant crisis, make it impossible to defend every front, normalize the abnormal through sheer repetition until people become numb to what would have been unthinkable months earlier. But we cannot allow ourselves to become numb because among a sample of children from low-income households entering kindergarten, receiving a free or reduced-price school lunch reduces the probability of household food insecurity at school entry, whereas paying full price for school lunch associated with a higher probability of household food insecurity, and these are real children with real bellies that hurt when they're empty, real families making impossible choices between rent and food and medicine, real communities being systematically denied the resources they need to survive, let alone thrive, and when a government official stands at a podium and brags about removing woke DEI requirements from programs designed to feed those children, we need to name it for what it is. We need to call it evil, not in some abstract theological sense, but in the very concrete sense of deliberately inflicting suffering on vulnerable people to advance an ideological agenda rooted in white supremacy. The bureaucratic language and the professional setting, and the neat charts and statistics are all designed to obscure the violence being enacted, to make it seem like policy rather than cruelty. But stripping equity protections from child nutrition programs is violence, denying farmers of color access to grants and markets is violence, dismantling every institutional mechanism that might challenge racial hierarchy is violence, and we need to name it as such. The resist this demands is multifaceted, because we're fighting on terrain they've chosen, defending programs and frameworks that were themselves inadequate, while they work to eliminate even those insufficient protections. And we need simultaneously to defend DEI programs from elimination, while also acknowledging that DEI frameworks were never sufficient to address the depth of structural racism and economic exploitation that characterizes American capitalism, that we need far more radical transformation than diversity training and equity audits, that the goal isn't just better representation in existing hierarchies, but the abolition of those hierarchies altogether. But in this moment when they're trying to make even the language of equity illegal, even the acknowledgement of discrimination unspeakable, the defense of DEI frameworks becomes a necessary holding action, a way to preserve institutional memory and practices that can be built upon later, and we cannot allow them to erase the knowledge and relationships and programs that activists and advocates fought for decades to establish. So what do? We fight back on every front simultaneously. We support the organizations suing to block these executive orders. We pressure state and local governments to implement their own equity protections and expand programs like universal free school meals. We organize mutual aid networks to feed hungry kids that the federal government is abandoning. We tell these stories. We connect the dots between the farm-to-school grants and the dietary guidelines and the DEI purge and the larger project of authoritarian transformation. We refuse to be gaslit into believing that this is normal or acceptable, or anything other than what it is, a comprehensive assault on multiracial democracy and the very possibility of justice. We remember that 8 states, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Vermont, have passed healthy school meals for all policies, so schools can offer all students school breakfast and lunch at no cost to families, and these policies reduce childhood food insecurity, stretch family budgets, and ensure all children are hunger-free and ready to get the most out of their school day. Which proves that different policies are possible, that we don't have to accept a reality where children go hungry, and farmers struggle, and equity is treated as a dirty word, that we can build systems that actually feed people and support sustainable agriculture and advance justice simultaneously. But building those systems requires confronting the reality that this administration and the movement behind it are not interested in policy debates or evidence-based governance. They're interested in power, in reasserting white Christian male dominance in every domain of American life, and they understand that food is power, that controlling who eats and who doesn't is fundamental to maintaining hierarchies, that dismantling the programs and frameworks that redistribute resources toward marginalized communities is essential to their larger project. And so this fight over farm-to-school grants, this woman standing at a podium bragging about removing woke DEI requirements, is not a sideshow or a distraction, but a front line in the larger struggle over what kind of country we're going to be. Whether we're going to move toward a multiracial democracy that actually delivers material abundance and dignity to all people, or whether we're going to entrench ever deeper forms of hierarchy and exploitation justified through ever more sophisticated mechanisms of ideological control. The choice has never been clearer, and the stakes have never been higher, and we need everyone in this fight because they're coming for the children's food, and if we let them win here, there's nowhere left to retreat to. No domain of life they won't colonize, in service of their vision of America, restored to its properly hierarchical natural order. This is the fight, and we need you in it, and the time is now.